Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was one of those rare and memorable moments in this House that happen from time to time. And I want to thank my colleague from Montague-Kilmuir for the bravery and the courage to show your vulnerability as you just have, and to tell Islanders that mental health is an issue that is there for every single one of us. And I am sorry for the distress you have clearly felt recently. And I really thank you for saying what you just did. A book I read many, many years ago, Mr. Speaker, and I can't not speak to what the member has just said before I get to my official response. The title of the book is I'm Okay, You're Okay. And in reality, that's not the case at all. None of us is okay. None of you is okay. We all have our struggles, each in our own area. And again, I want to thank the member for the honesty, the openness, the vulnerability that he has just shown. I think it's important for us as leaders in the community not to have a facade that we're impregnable, that everything is okay in our lives, because it's not. And I was just very touched by what you said, and I want to thank you for it. It's my honor, Mr. Speaker, to rise today and to respond to the throne speech, and to be the leader of the official opposition in Prince Edward Island, and to be the representative of the citizens of District 17, New Haven, Rocky Point. It is a privilege to sit in this House, and I never forget that. Always try and remind myself of how lucky we are to be here. The central defining characteristic of our country is the constant tension between the unique and largely independent provinces that are also part of a grand singular collective called Canada. As Canada's smallest province, Prince Edward Island has all of the jurisdictional privileges of the other provinces, with all of the unique benefits that come with being able to craft our own path, which is suited to our unique individual particular situation. The last year has shown very clearly the benefits of this relative independence. We were, at least from a public health perspective, able to navigate the pandemic arguably better than any other place on earth. And that was in large part because of our ability to make our own choices and because of our islandness. That doesn't mean that we weren't susceptible to the economic and social disruption that accompanied the pandemic across this entire planet. This is a pivotal moment in history, and it presents our province with a rich opportunity to respond to that disruption and to set our sights on a future that will best meet the needs of all islanders. Our island's greatest strength lies in our collective sense of responsibility and of well-being, and that's been talked about here today. This social cohesion is responsible for the strong community resilience which helped guide us through this pandemic to date, and it's the same force that will craft our prosperous future together. The official opposition envisages a future that works to repair the damage of the pre-COVID economy and creates a regenerative island economy built on the fact that every single islander is equal and deserves to be treated as such, and that we are all part of this earth. The well-being of all people and the planet will flow from the work that we do together, recognizing that caring for each other and for the earth is the most important work of all. And here on Prince Edward Island, we have the opportunity to create our own distinct future, sweeping away the systemic structures of an unjust and unsustainable world, and replacing that with a society that instills and creates balance and provides dignity and security for all. Government will play a critical role in achieving this vision. And while it may seem that everything has changed since the Great Disruption last March, many of the issues the official opposition raised about the throne speech in 2019 are still very present today and still in desperate need of attention. A throne speech is the time for government to express its big dreams and to tether those dreams to practical and attainable policy. Making good choices now in all of these areas will set Prince Edward Island up for a future that is both fair and sustainable. COVID has indeed presented challenges, enormous challenges, but it's also created opportunities. It presents us with an opening to imagine a different kind of future. Politics, when it is practiced skillfully, will choose policies that pave the way to a better future. Politicians are, in one sense, succession planners. And when we do our job well, our children and their children benefit from our work. I'm constantly reminding myself of the privilege that we have by virtue of our place in this House, of being able to introduce ideas, to debate them, and to pass them into law. Only 27 islanders sit in these seats, and we are the only ones able to do that. And that is both a heady prospect and a heavy responsibility. This chamber can be both inspiring and exasperating. It is at its best when we bring forward big ideas and debate them with open minds and good hearts. It is at its worst when the chamber is overtaken, as it all too often is, by small-minded pettiness and partisanship. The gift of jurisdiction that we have as a small province gives us broad responsibilities on some of the issues that most profoundly impact islanders' lives every day. We can, to a far greater extent than most comparably sized places, chart our own course. We can be bold. We can be innovative. We can be distinct and unique. And I call on us, all of us who sit here in this time, in this place, to be just that, to be courageous, to be imaginative in our deliberations and in our decisions. There is much wrong with the world, and we have a chance to face up to it. The injustice, the exploitation, the damage being done to individuals, to communities, and to the natural world. Perhaps we can't change the whole world from here, but we surely can change this little corner of it that we are blessed to call home, Prince Edward Island. Mr. Speaker, I sense a deep unrest in our community, and I'm sure that many of you feel that too. There was a time when citizens had confidence that their governments could look out for the common good, that they had the power to shape things, to carve our future. I speak to a lot of people who fear that this is no longer the case, that things are quite literally out of control. And by that I mean out of the control of the democratic institutions in which we have placed our trust and our faith for hundreds of years, or in the case of the indigenous people of this land, who have their own very sophisticated democratic systems for hundreds of generations and for tens of thousands of years. The power of influence has shifted from democratically elected governments to institutions that are in many ways much bigger, more powerful and richer than most national governments. I'm talking, of course, of corporations. Where once governments could control boundaries and set national policies that reflected the will of the citizens, now our economy is increasingly dominated by businesses beyond the control of governments, acting outside the will of the citizens. The ability, or perhaps more accurately, the political will to raise sufficient taxes to provide high-quality essential services like healthcare and education and transportation and elder care has been eroded to the point where we see private enterprises stepping into all of these areas, often with very negative impacts. The closure of regional transportation hubs and routes, for example, and that's something that we can all identify with here on Prince Edward Island. The unequal access to post-secondary education, and most recently and devastatingly, deaths in overcrowded and understaffed seniors' homes, though thankfully, of course, we avoided that situation here on Prince Edward Island. This is often the result of those very corporations lobbying and pressuring government for lower tax rates, for perks, for incentives, for tax holidays. And these may be, of course, a boon for the corporations, but they become very quickly a liability for governments. These corporate perks lower government's fiscal capacity, while those corporations greatly benefit. We've transitioned from a market economy, which I would absolutely support when well regulated, to a market society, where increasingly everything is for sale, and it's difficult sometimes to distinguish citizens from consumers. We have conceded the paving of the road ahead to entities that are more concerned about next quarter profits than they are about the next generation. And quite predictably, Mr. Speaker, this has led to a society where young people enter the workforce, if even there is employment for them, to precarious, low-paying jobs without benefits or protections, unable to afford housing in their community, and for those who attend post-secondary education, crippled with debt, and all of them by stresses that are impacting their mental health. It's no wonder that our province chronically struggles to retain our best and our brightest young people. We have an opportunity to reimagine our future, to decide that quality of life is more important than money. We can reflect on our path forward for Prince Edward Island, the reality that we are one human family on a shared planet. We can decide that 500 years of a colonialism is enough. We can reject and dismantle the systemic racism and discrimination that has plagued our society for centuries. We can challenge the unjust power structures where the voices of the privileged few so often speak for the majority. We can decide that centuries of growing, expanding corporate power is enough. We can decide that centuries of burning fossil fuels is enough. We can and must confront and move on from all of these things that have come to dominate our society and which cause us so much distress and so much dissatisfaction. Prince Edward Island is uniquely placed to move on to a better place and to secure for our citizens, both present and future, the autonomy, the dignity, the democracy, the freedom, safety, equity, and the opportunity to seek meaning in our lives that is the birthright of all. As we emerge from the pandemic, there will be many important choices to make about how we collectively recover and rebuild, choices that will affect islanders for decades to come. We may never be able to return all aspects of island life to pre-pandemic conditions, and in some respects that's probably okay. But in this moment, right now, here, we are presented with the opportunity to rebuild our economy and our province and our society in a way that is fairer, that is cleaner, and that is inclusive for all. This post-pandemic recovery is going to take a great deal of work. While all islanders and businesses will be involved in this work, it is government that must take the lead on the planning and recovery so that no islanders are left behind. Yesterday, we heard the speech from the throne. It represented what is meant to be government's vision for the province. And what a trite, timid, and tepid vision for our island it was. We have T3 transit, we now have a T3 speech from the throne. At a time of such great opportunity, why show so much political restraint, so little willingness to be bold and to be audacious? From what we heard yesterday, it seems that the Premier is happy with the status quo. He's content with the state of our mental health and addiction services. He is fine with a housing crisis that continues. He is okay to see so many islanders without a family doctor. In fact, he went as far to say it's unrealistic for islanders to expect to have that. Although I take that he did say access to primary medical services in a collaborative situation is fine. But it seems that in many respects, this Premier is giving up to a certain extent on some of the issues that are absolutely critical to the health and the well-being of all islanders. So why, I asked, did this government need a reset? I'm not really sure why the Premier felt that a reset for this government agenda was needed, when what we heard yesterday simply commits to largely continuing to do what is already being done. This government is choosing to step back from a future that is beckoning us, that is begging us to think big and to be daring. If ever there was a time when governments have been called not to step back, but to step up, it is now. This is why I have called this throne speech timid and trite and tepid. That alone is disappointing, if not shocking. But I can't fathom how the Premier feels that the work his government has been doing is anywhere near satisfactory in addressing the wicked problems that islanders are facing. These problems, of course, existed long before the pandemic, and if definitive and decisive action is not taken, they will continue to persist long after COVID is gone. This is a critical time in island history and it demands a historic and bold response from government. And this speech from the throne certainly was not that. Government is not prepared to be the leader islanders so desperately need at this time of upheaval and uncertainty. And when you hear words like, and I quote, "our approach will be evolutionary and not revolutionary," you know that government to a certain extent has checked out. Evolution is a term that we use to describe change over generations. Truthfully, I probably should not be surprised. Slow change over generations has been a hallmark of Liberal and Conservative governments that have led this province for decades. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the change our province desperately needs today cannot happen over generations. It is needed now. I recall sitting in this House just a few years ago and hearing the Conservatives who sat in these seats chastise what they referred to repeatedly as a tired Liberal government. Ironically, the Premier and his Conservative government have been in power just 2 years, and it seems to me that already they appear to be tired, unwilling, and incapable of presenting a decisive vision for a post-COVID PEI.
Who wrote that for you? That's not you. You don't say stuff like that.
Oh, couldn't even say it with a straight face.
Somebody wrote that for you. Use your own words.
It also seems to be a pattern of this Premier to woo islanders with wonderful promises and stories. Admittedly, this is the Premier practicing his very fine skills of good storytelling, but it's not stories that make meaningful improvements to the health and well-being of islanders and its province. It's good policy. Islanders have been very clear and vocal in their dissatisfaction with the response of the Premier and his cabinet on the critical issues that are impacting families, youth, seniors, and island businesses. By our count, government in the throne speech introduced 8 new funds and 6 new agencies yesterday. Yet no long-term economic recovery plan for our province. Throwing money at a new fund or agency all sounds well and good, but it's not enough, especially when it will only likely increase bureaucratic red tape and it will do nothing to help islanders right now. We may simply end up spending more money to create more bureaucracy and more confusion. I wonder, is the Premier using the success of our health response to COVID to mask his inability to create a long-term post-COVID recovery for our island. Given how less severe COVID has been here on PEI than anywhere else, this government had such an opportunity, had all the more time to prepare a plan for this recovery. Why did it squander that opportunity? Healthcare services, including mental health and addiction services, are essential for the physical and mental well-being of all islanders, as well as the active participation of those islanders in the labour market and our economy. The Premier claims that mental health is one of his government's priorities going forward, yet we saw hardly a mention or update on the new mental health hospital or campus, and certainly no reassurances that government will be expediting construction of this hospital, something our caucus included in our submission to government for the throne speech. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this government's apparent urgent commitment to mental health services went from shovels in the ground on day one to here's a phone number, please hold, your call is important to us. Please hold the shovel for 2 years. This call is important to us. It's true that this new single point of access phone line is a sign that the Premier is finally starting to understand and realise just how significant a crisis mental health is here on Prince Edward Island. However, I'm not sure that this is going far enough to reach those who are in crisis, or if it will actually help people in the midst of a mental health emergency. First of all, how will this work? Is it like 211 and only directs to other services? Will people actually be referred and have appointments made through this line? Will the navigators of this service be island-based staff with special training and some amount of mental health expertise? We currently have a mental health and addictions phone line that is indeed answered by trained health and addiction staff between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. on weekdays. So is this simply an expanding of that service to be 24/7? So many questions, so little information. For this to truly work as a single point of access, we need trained PEI-based staff answering the calls, the ability to directly refer callers to services like detox, like the Hillsborough Hospital, counselling services and other supports, trauma-informed training, and the ability to communicate with EMS if that's necessary in a particular case. This new phone line cannot simply be a warehouse of support, cannot simply be a clearinghouse for islanders in mental distress. It must be connected to a warehouse full of supports and services that are immediately available to be dispatched when those calls come. Just this week, Mr. Speaker, I received an email from a constituent whose granddaughter has been waiting for over a year for a psychiatric consultation, only to find out just yesterday that yet again the appointment has been cancelled for the 4th time. We have to acknowledge that it's far more than simply getting information about services. Indeed, information may actually be unhelpful when islanders continue to face long wait times to access services and barriers to accessing those services in a timely manner, when islanders actually need the help right there and then. Referring people in crisis into a void is going to do perhaps more damage to those same islanders who have already suffered because of this government and its choices. We must have the services. They must be properly funded. This cannot simply be a clearinghouse. Mr. Speaker, let me remind you that this government, under the leadership of this Premier, chose to close almost all mental health and addiction services during the early days of the pandemic, while many other health services, and those were deemed, they of course were deemed necessary too, were kept open. Unit 9, the transition unit, in-person counselling, almost all of those were closed immediately. And when push came to shove and difficult choices had to be made, this Premier showed just how much he does not prioritise mental health. This government owes islanders not only increased services, but an apology to those affected and their loved ones. It's critical that government take meaningful, immediate action on this growing crisis that is impacting so many island families every day. A full 9 is just not enough for islanders who are in crisis. Islanders also expect government to work to ensure that they are able to get the care they need in their own communities. And I do appreciate the words in the throne speech about establishing community-based, multidisciplinary healthcare centres. And I truly hope that this is one of those times when the actions of government will actually meet the promises that are written on the page. The recruitment and retention of frontline healthcare staff is, of course, a key component to building a comprehensive and successful healthcare system from tip to tip on Prince Edward Island. Government seems to think that throwing dollars at recruitment and tension is all it takes, that that's going to be sufficient, but history has proven that that is not true. There is no thought given to the holistic experience of living on Prince Edward Island, things like the availability of housing, the lack of high-speed rural internet, and the lack of transportation possibilities and alternatives. All of these things impact retention efforts. And having people on the ground to support these new families who are arriving here at difficult times in their lives, they need really strong supports in their communities for not just the healthcare professional that's coming, but for her husband, his wife, their children. All of the family needs have to be met in order for that true support to retain these healthcare professionals when they come here at a difficult time in their lives, when they are often overworked and given new responsibilities in a strange place. We are not providing the supports they need, and retention is a critical part of making sure that all islanders have access to primary healthcare services when they need them and where they need them. We need trained healthcare workers working in the field to even adequately attract more workers. And the throne speech described recruitment as happening in a competitive marketplace, which is absolutely true. Enormously competitive marketplace. So how about, rather than trying to compete to lure health professionals with big bucks only, we use our enormous competitive advantage of being a fabulous place to live. Discerning people recognize that quality of life is more important than money. If we focus on what the island provides so effortlessly and so naturally, the safety, the purity, the peacefulness, the community that epitomizes our province, I believe then we will attract the health professionals that we need and would truly make inroads into the patient registry to finally provide those local primary healthcare services that all islanders, wherever you live, deserve. But to do that, we must also address and fix the things that make the island a difficult place to live. Mr. Speaker, we know that not everybody has access to the same quality care in our society, and we need to do more to close those gaps and to decrease the inequality everywhere, but particularly in our healthcare system. As part of our caucus's speech from the throne submission, we asked that government increase funding for the PEI PharmaCare formulary, to implement a protocol to enable funding for treatments available on the formulary for rare diseases, while also being more transparent and thoughtful in its response processes for formulary requests. Our office, and I'm sure other offices represented in this legislature, receive emails and calls regularly from islanders with serious diseases that, if only they had access to the right medications, they could prolong their lives and increase their quality of life. And every contact I have received, I have forwarded to the Minister of Health and asked that they consider increasing the funding for the formulary. It pains me to tell the islanders that reach out to me that I don't have the power to give them access to these life-saving drugs, but that the people who do, thus far, have not listened to our pleas to increase funding for the formulary. I sincerely hope that a substantial increase in the formulary, at the very least to get us on par with the other Atlantic provinces, will be announced in the coming budget. I am so disappointed not to see it discussed as a priority in this throne speech. We also, of course, requested that government extend dental care coverage to seniors and low-income islanders with no private dental coverage. This was actually something that was promised in the last budget, but as far as I'm aware, has yet to materialise. And we requested that government provide more supports for islanders living with diabetes by eliminating age discrimination in the provincial insulin pump programme and providing offloading devices to all islanders in need. Still nothing. We also asked that the shingles vaccine be made available to all seniors. Still nothing. For years, islanders have called for more autonomy and choice when it comes to planning their pregnancy, including having the option of a midwife as part of their birth plan. Government must finally fulfil its promise and implement midwifery on the island. We also expect government to introduce the long-promised women's health strategy to focus on women's health and well-being across the healthcare system. You cannot continue to say that you support and prioritise women's health without actually implementing any measures that benefit them. Since the start of this pandemic, we have seen just how important it is for politicians to listen to the experts. PEI has weathered COVID so successfully in large part because health experts like Dr. Heather Morrison and Chief Nurse Marion Dowling are steering the ship. Government must reduce the potential for political interference and return decision-making in health PEI to the experts. And the best way to begin the long and difficult journey of improving healthcare on PEI is to return that decision-making to the experts by putting the Health PEI Board back in charge of making decisions. Thank you, Premier, for that. I look forward to your support on the bill that we'll be bringing forward to accomplish just that legislatively.
Yeah, it makes sense, so I'll certainly do it.
Thank you. None of these requests to improve our healthcare system were included in yesterday's speech from the throne. And I'm at a loss as to understand how any government could exclude such fundamental and important initiatives for its vision for this province. The Premier has said that this throne speech represents a reset and that it repositions his government to prepare for the post-COVID recovery that we are all slowly but surely entering. It's true that the choices we make now will have a profound impact on the future of our province. And this pandemic, of course, has been historic in the devastation that it has caused to our island economy and communities. We will indeed have much rebuilding to do in the coming years, and I'm glad to see that this government is committed to being an active part of that recovery. But the island economy that COVID devastated was not without its flaws. And I've often argued in this House before that before the pandemic, our economy was in need of a major transition, whether because of climate change or regional disparities or the glaring fact that our provincial economy here on Prince Edward Island keeps about 40% of islanders living in poverty. Everybody acknowledges that we need to rebuild the economy. But what kind of economy we build is our choice. We can choose to rebuild the same economy that we had in the pre-pandemic, or we can choose to build an island economy that is clean and is prosperous for all islanders. And while I absolutely see some potential in the efforts outlined to build a clean tech economy sector here on Prince Edward Island, the throne speech is utterly lacking in its vision for the future of the rest of the island economy. For instance, the speech includes some supports to help the tourism sector to stay afloat through the next few months, which is absolutely critical, of course, but there's nothing beyond that. And we know that cruise ships, for example, will perhaps never likely return to their pre-pandemic heights. The challenge is not only how do we keep our businesses afloat through COVID, but how do we help the industry adapt to the post-COVID world, not to the pre-COVID world, but to the post-COVID world. This government is showing no vision whatsoever for the future of tourism or economic development more broadly. And again, it's not like we haven't had an opportunity, we haven't had time to develop that vision. As I already stated, and as we all know, Prince Edward Island has been extremely fortunate to have avoided the worst of COVID. And I would have thought that our good management would have allowed this government to divert some focus away from the immediate needs of the pandemic response towards the development of a policy response for economic recovery. At least what I've seen in the public domain, it appears to me that this has not happened. A big part of the economic development plan, if one can call it that, seems to be getting people off of CERB and into jobs. Now, worth speaking a little bit about this. When the Premier made a similar remark in the early days of the pandemic, Islanders were rightfully upset. CERB has been an essential life support for so many Islanders and Canadians. And of course, we're grateful that the federal government was there and they stepped up to deliver that necessary program. And the results achieved by CERB were and are absolutely remarkable. Problem is that some people were making more money than they were in their previous employment, increasing their standard of living and their ability to stimulate their local economies. And we saw decreases in the number of Canadians declaring bankruptcy over typical years. The Premier, I think, rightfully backed away from his statement in those early days, and he's been walking it back ever since. But it's worth asking why Islanders are reluctant to return to some of those former jobs. It's worth asking why a federal government program that was designed to provide roughly minimum amount of financial assistance for people to actually survive has led to better economic outcomes for some people. And honestly, I think this government is neither ready nor equipped nor understands the difficulties and is ready to make those difficult choices and have that difficult conversation regarding how our economy needs to be transformed. Government has spent so much time and energy framing the discussion of our economic challenges as labour force issues, and it's not that those are not there, but they've spent so much time saying that workers aren't skilled enough, Islanders don't want to work, and so forth. Rarely does government ask what our industries and employers are doing for island workers. PEI governments have been very gracious towards large corporate interests here. Grants, loans, wage subsidies, tax cuts, tax credits, training programs, you name it. None of the millions of dollars these programs represent raises even an eyebrow. Conversely, you give a working-age Islander some CERB money, a little bit of money, a tiny bit of money to ensure that they can just meet their basic needs and survive, and government loses its mind. It's shameful, and it's beneath a government that says that it is about people. It's no surprise then that government drags its feet when it is asked to better support vulnerable workers by raising the minimum wage. These are some of the very people who are at greatest risk of contracting COVID, and yet they face insufficient wages, precarious job security, little or no paid sick leave, and inconsistent hours. In fact, many of the COVID outbreaks that we've seen on Prince Edward Island and beyond have been related to businesses where employees likely would be earning the minimum wage or thereabouts. And sadly, it seems that the case of the recent cluster in Summerside may indeed be another example of this. To reward these workers for their efforts to keep Islanders fed and cared for, to provide these essential services, what did government do? It gave them a 15-cent raise to the minimum wage, one of the smallest increases in modern PEI history. And although government loves to talk about making PEI a competitive place for businesses, it is clear that it has little to no interest in making it a competitive place for everyday workers. We care about wages, Mr. Speaker, because that's what fuels our economy. They are what islanders use to buy local goods and services. They are, in part, what gives islanders a sense of financial security or insecurity. They are what islanders use to feed and clothe themselves. They determine whether islanders will be able to buy a home or start a family. I could go on and on about the islanders falling behind under this government. So I think I will. Mr. Speaker, while I'm happy to see some health initiatives geared towards seniors, I'm gravely concerned about the lack of economic support to lift seniors out of poverty and allow them to live with security and dignity. The government loves to talk about collaboration in this House, and admittedly, sometimes that, at least recently, has felt like a one-way street. We are frequently asked to provide input or suggestions into various government initiatives, and we don't always see a reflection of that input, and that's fair. I don't expect you to take all of our ideas, but sometimes when government does use our ideas, it will gladly unveil them as their own and take all the credit. No, that has happened on a number of occasions. But we do not.
Not in anyone in the history of this place. Come on.
There is collaboration, but sometimes those ideas do not. Yeah, we do not.
You don't believe that.
You don't care about Islanders if that's all you want is credit.
Mr. Speaker,
Do you care about Islanders or do you care about credit?
we do not present these ideas to take credit for them, to answer your question, Minister. We advance them because we think they will lead to meaningful improvements in the lives of islanders. With that said,
You're dropping in the balls.
With that said, you could only imagine my dread to see a lacking vision for seniors. Our pre-budget submission included expansive tax relief for seniors, and there is no such vision for relief here. Our seniors have worked and volunteered so much time and effort over the years to make this province what it is. There is no excuse for not doing more for them. A prosperous economy is one in which all islanders thrive. Government innovation and entrepreneurship programs should be broadened to include sectors such as tourism, arts and culture, and the traditional emphasis that export-focused businesses have always had here on Prince Edward Island. They should also be reviewed, especially in the context of decarbonising our economy. Diversity and inclusion targets to support underrepresented groups must be incorporated into all of our economic development programs. Mr. Speaker, a prosperous island economy is also one in which all island communities thrive. Rural and urban communities are interdependent, so we must ensure that both are doing well, which is why I'm alarmed by the total lack of any mention of rural and a vision for it.
You were mad when we paved all rural PEI?
Not my part of rural PEI, you didn't. If you
You're right, because you don't like pavement.
I did not say that. I
Over and over and over.
I want
That's all
equitable.
you said.
I want
All you've
equitable.
The last 6 months, you don't like pavement.
I want equitable access to good transportation systems across this province for every
don't
island,
pay
and we
any-
have not seen that with the spending of this government.
Just don't spend any money on pavement.
Don't fix the culvert, don't pay.
Okay,
Don't do anything.
ministers.
A prosperous economy is one in which all islanders thrive. Government innovation and entrepreneurship programs should be broadened to include sectors such as tourism, arts and culture, and traditional emphasis. I've already said that. I'm going to carry on, Mr. Speaker. Given our ageing population, which is particularly acute in some rural areas, one of the key drivers of rural vitality, both socially and economically, is going to be immigration. Increasingly, we're realizing that one of the keys to successfully integrating newcomers is the involvement of local communities. The federal government has recognized this and is creating a municipal nominee program. With much of rural PEI, of course, being unincorporated, will this government simply let so much of our rural areas and so many rural communities miss out on this opportunity? Rural vitality will need strong local governance, and this province needs to work with local communities and stakeholders towards building that strong local governance across the island so that we can properly access this federal programme. Mr. Speaker, creating a prosperous and sustainable agricultural sector is fundamental to the well-being of farmers and the financial and environmental sustainability of rural Prince Edward Island. I'm glad to see in the throne speech that this government intends to work with farmers on a variety of measures to improve environmental sustainability. I hope these programs will also contribute to the economic sustainability of agriculture, because of course those two things are inextricably linked. Mr. Speaker, the well-being of rural Prince Edward Island has always been tied to the land. The throne speech notes that, and I quote, "Land has always been one of the most precious resources that we have in our province." And I agree with that statement. In fact, probably I go further and to say it is the most precious resource that we have in our province. However, the dissonance between this statement and government's handling of the issue of land ownership leaves me deeply concerned. Current conflicts around land use and land ownership are not only hurting farmers, but they are also tearing at the social fabric of rural communities. For something with such importance to islanders, such cultural and historical significance, this government, I have to say, to my great surprise and dismay, has been utterly impotent. In the last speech from the throne, the last one, not this one, the last one, this government was resolute in its commitment to champion and uphold the spirit and intent of the Lands Protection Act. Since that time, it has done nothing. It has done nothing but hide behind privacy concerns, and it's delayed action. Government is perpetually saying amendments to the Lands Protection Act and the Planning Act will be ready for the next sitting of this House. And every single sitting, we get nothing. In this new throne speech, the commitment only a couple of lines were snuck in towards the very end, and it's very muted. We will have an interim report on amendments, predictably, in the next sitting. Islanders have been calling for changes for years, for better enforcement and greater transparency, none of which this current government seems willing to provide. We've been talking about bringing in a provincial land use policy since 1973, when the Royal Commission of Land Ownership and Land Use was struck. That's almost 50 years ago. The reason we don't have change is not that we need more time. For goodness sake, we don't need more time. It's that governments have chosen not to act. And evidently, we're seeing the same old story from this current government. Mr. Speaker, the protection of our water is a critical debate, not only in this House, but in our island communities. After years and years and years of delay by both the last government and the current one, we finally got the news that the Water Act will finally come into effect this June. And while this is indeed good news, I'm puzzled that there was no mention of how this government intends to continue to develop water protections into the future. Government seems to think that its work is done with the proclamation of the Water Act, but really, the work of implementing the robust water protection regime that we need is only just beginning. There are big decisions that need to be made on things like holding ponds, on irrigation, and on high-capacity wells, and controlling excessive water withdrawals from municipalities. This government continues to allow water withdrawals in violation of its own policies. We just saw this last year in the Dunk River when withdrawals were permitted when the river was below the maintenance level set by this government. And Charlottetown continues to extract more water from the Winter River than its permit from the province allows. But the province does nothing to enforce these rules, which are already in place. How does the government expect us to believe that it will enforce the Water Act? Proclaiming the Act is only the very first step. A decisive shift is still needed, and judging by this throne speech, we can expect this government to continue to punt these difficult decisions down the road for yet another government to take care of. Mr. Speaker, climate change is a crisis that was overshadowed by the pandemic. But as we emerge from COVID-19, the urgency of reducing emissions and adapting to climate change must once again be front of mind for our government and this province. From the throne speech, it would seem that the core of government's plan is to grow the clean tech sector and to fund research. Now, don't get me wrong, those are really worthy efforts and I applaud them, and they could help to develop some of the innovations for future governments. But climate change is not only a problem of the future, it is unquestionably a problem that demands action today. It is a problem of the present. It requires immediate and decisive action. A good portion of the technologies and solutions needed to tackle climate change, of course, already exist, and we need to rapidly adopt those proven and available solutions. I'm glad to see a further expansion of energy efficiency initiatives, of course, and especially the focus for low-income islanders. I applaud government for that. Thank you. It is indeed good, but let's remember that it's really the lowest of the low-hanging fruit. Mr. Speaker, as we all know, transportation is the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in our province. Government's plan to clean transportation seems to be a vague promise to implement an island-wide transit system, something we've heard talk about, of course, before, but with very little actual follow-through. Now, I look forward to seeing that. It's something which, as I mentioned earlier in my speech, is a critical part of creating that equality and that ability for islanders to live anywhere in this province and have equal access to services, and for their quality of life to be equitable. So we need that. But we also need other things. We need more than just words on a page when it comes to creating an island-wide transit system. We need more than that. We also, on the page, read that it's going to encourage greater use of electric vehicles. Now, that sounds all well and fine, but encourage is not the language of a government that's intent on delivering transformative change. A legislated shift to 100% of vehicle sales being zero-emission vehicles by 2030 is the sort of decisive and ambitious goal that I would expect from a government that is actually serious on tackling climate change. Furthermore, it's somewhat baffling that there is no mention in this throne speech of further investments in renewable energy and renewable electricity generation. The electricity system, of course, cannot be converted overnight. It takes years and years to build and adapt infrastructure. So how does this government expect to reach net zero by 2030, less than 10 years from now, if it is not committed to the immediate expansion of renewables across this island?